Whispers behind palace walls are nothing new, but this one was different. It was personal. When Princess Anne intercepted a remark that Meghan Markle allegedly made about Catherine, Princess of Wales, it wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. And once Anne heard it, she knew there would be no going back. But what exactly did Meghan say? And why did Anne, usually so composed, decide this could not stay hidden? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What made this moment so dangerous wasn't volume or spectacle, but intent. The words reached Anne quietly, passed through trusted channels, carried by someone who understood precisely what they meant and why they mattered. This was not gossip drifting through corridors. It was a sentence spoken with purpose, aimed with precision, and sharpened by timing. Anne recognized it instantly, not as a careless remark, but as something designed to linger, to erode, to plant doubt where certainty had been carefully built for years. For Anne, loyalty has never been performative. It is rooted in memory, endurance, and an unspoken code that predates modern headlines. She had watched Catherine grow into her role through pressure that would have broken most people, absorbing criticism while maintaining silence, choosing restraint when retaliation would have been easier. Hearing Catherine reduced, questioned, or strategically undermined by someone who once stood within the same inner circle struck a nerve Anne rarely allowed to show. This wasn't about rivalry. It was about respect and the deliberate absence of it. The remark itself carried layers. On the surface, it questioned Catherine's strength. Beneath that, it implied instability, and deeper still, it hinted at something far more dangerous. A future where Catherine's position, credibility, and influence could be quietly challenged without ever needing a public confrontation. Anne understood the implication immediately. This wasn't an attack on personality, it was an attack on trajectory, on destiny, on the carefully balanced future of the monarchy itself. Memories resurfaced earlier moments where tensions had been brushed aside for the sake of unity. Polite smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Conversations that felt cordial but hollow. Anne had noticed them all, storing them away, choosing patience over escalation. But patience has limits. And this time, the line had been crossed so cleanly that ignoring it would have felt like complicity. Instead of reacting emotionally, Anne did what she had always done best. She observed, she listened, she confirmed. Names were noted. Timing was reconstructed. Context was examined. The remark was replayed in her mind not once, but repeatedly, each time revealing another layer of intention. By the time Anne finished, this was no longer hearsay. It was a pattern, and patterns demand response. Anne knew confronting Meghan directly would only fracture things further, at least for now. The stakes were too high, the consequences too unpredictable. There was only one person who needed to hear this first, one person whose reaction would determine everything that followed. And as Anne prepared to speak, she understood that once this truth was shared, nothing inside the royal family would remain untouched. But before Anne could confront Meghan, she made a fateful decision to tell William first. When Anne told William what Meghan had said, it wasn't calm, it was volcanic. William's rage didn't come from protocol, it came from pain. What was spoken wasn't just a slight against Catherine, it was a threat to their bond, their children, and the throne itself. And for William, there was only one word for it: unforgivable. Anne chose her moment with precision. Catherine had been called away for a quiet engagement, giving Anne the opportunity she needed to speak to William without interruption. This was not a conversation to be had in passing. It required clarity, control, and timing. And when Anne delivered the line, Meghan had spoken word for word. She did so with the kind of unflinching seriousness that made William immediately understand the weight of it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't move. He sat, frozen, the silence between them thick with unspoken meaning. Then came the reaction, sharp, raw, and entirely unscripted. She said what? Words didn't need repeating. William had heard them clearly the first time, but something in him needed to say it aloud, to believe it had really been said. The fury that followed wasn't performative. It was the accumulated weight of years. William had played the diplomat. He had tolerated whispers, rumors, and private insults for the sake of the crown. But this was aimed at Catherine's role as the future queen. It questioned her strength, her stability, her very place in the royal structure. It wasn't just about Catherine's character, it was about her capability. The remark, subtle yet searing, was wrapped in enough ambiguity to be denied in public, but was unmistakable in its private meaning. And for William, the implication couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just an insult. It was a provocation. He remembered past slights, the headlines, the press battles, the cleverly worded interviews and carefully timed documentaries. There had always been an edge, a coded message, a grievance veiled in charm. But this wasn't veiled. It was direct, and it was dangerous. In that moment, William realized that Meghan wasn't just speaking out of frustration, she was undermining the future Catherine had been preparing for her entire adult life. And perhaps more disturbingly, it had been said with full awareness of its implications. Anne watched quietly as William paced the room, his face shifting from disbelief to fury, then into something colder resolve. He didn't ask Anne if she was sure. He didn't demand evidence. He knew Anne wouldn't come to him unless she was certain. What he wanted now wasn't damage control. He didn't ask how they could spin this or whether a statement should be released. What he wanted was action, confrontation. He was done playing by rules that others refused to follow. He made it clear this would not be ignored. It wouldn't be buried beneath a mountain of palace silence or wrapped in platitudes about family unity. This was a direct attack, and he intended to treat it as one. But even in his fury, one question still remained unanswered, one decision still hovered, heavy and unresolved. Because as much as William burned with the need to act, he hesitated on one point: should Catherine ever know the truth? But the question wasn't just what William would do it was whether Catherine should ever know the truth. Catherine had faced media storms, family rifts and public scrutiny, but this cut deeper. Not because of who said it, but because it was said so coldly. When William told her what Meghan had said behind her back, it wasn't the insult that broke her, it was the betrayal. And what she did next shocked even Anne. For days, William had carried the weight of Anne's revelation like a secret too toxic to hold and too cruel to speak aloud. He tried to suppress it, to shield Catherine from the blow, hoping it might dissipate in silence. But silence had already cost them too much. The longer he waited, the heavier it became. So, on a quiet evening, when the world outside was still, he told her, every word unfiltered, not softened, not polished, just the truth. At first, Catherine said nothing. Her breath caught. Her hands trembled just slightly. It wasn't rage that rose in her, it was something more painful. A quiet, controlled devastation that only those deeply wounded by someone they once defended could understand. The silence that followed stretched longer than William could bear. He reached for her, but she pulled back, not out of anger, but to gather herself. Her eyes didn't fill with tears immediately. They focused on the floor, searching for reason, logic, maybe even denial. But there was none. The words had been spoken. The trust had been shattered. Slowly, the dam broke. Not with sobs or fury, but with a single heart-wrenching tear that carried the weight of every time Catherine had chosen dignity over retaliation. And William, watching the woman he had spent years protecting, couldn't find the words to fix what had been done. She didn't cry for herself. She cried for what it meant for the years she had extended kindness in the face of coldness, the times she swallowed her own discomfort to offer Meghan peace. She had remembered the dresses, the bouquets, the forced smiles. She had remembered walking into rooms knowing her presence would be twisted, yet still offering grace. And worst of all, she remembered that week the infamous story that Meghan had cried before the wedding, when in truth, it was Catherine, who had wept and chose to say nothing as the truth was rewritten. That silent sacrifice now echoed like a betrayal in reverse. Anne entered quietly, summoned not by words but by the kind of grief that needs no announcement. She sat beside Catherine, saying nothing, only resting a hand on her shoulder. Two women, bound not just by family, but by understanding. Anne had always seen Catherine's quiet strength, but now she saw her breaking point, and that, more than anything, was what made this different. After a long pause, Catherine spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried finality. "Then it's time we stopped protecting her." It wasn't said with anger, it was said with clarity, the kind that comes when patience has finally expired. With that single line, the air shifted, the dynamic changed. Catherine wasn't stepping back, she was stepping forward, and from that moment, there was no turning back. But Catherine's heartbreak was only the beginning, because the monarchy was about to strike back. Anne didn't just bring the matter to William, she took it to the king. Behind closed doors in a silent corner of Balmoral, Anne laid out the full account, and Charles, once hesitant to intervene in family drama, was forced to make a choice. Protect the institution or protect the woman who undermined its future queen? The conversation unfolded, away from courtiers, cameras, and curated statements. It was just Anne, armed with clarity and purpose. And Charles caught between legacy and loyalty. She wasted no time with pleasantries. Her tone was deliberate, her words measured, but the impact was immediate. She recounted the remark Meghan had made, how it had been delivered, how it had landed, and what it meant not just for Catherine, but for the entire structure that held the monarchy together. She spoke of Catherine's composure, William's fury, and the looming fracture that would no longer remain hidden. Every sentence Anne delivered was a blow to the myth of family unity, and Charles felt it deeply. At first, Charles didn't speak. His disbelief lingered, not because he doubted Anne's truth, but because he understood the implications of acknowledging it. To admit the damage meant confronting a growing crisis the palace had tried too long to ignore. He stood at a precipice, one misstep, one word too public, and the House of Windsor could plunge into chaos. His concern, voiced quietly, was telling, what happens when this gets out? It wasn't a question of if, but when. He feared headlines, editorials, global commentary. But Anne, never one for spin, shut that down quickly. What happens if it doesn't? She snapped back. Her eyes didn't waver. She reminded him of scandals past the ones that grew monstrous because silence had fed them. Diana, Andrew, even the early Sussex exit. Each one a warning, each one sharpened by delay. Anne wasn't asking Charles for a sweeping gesture. She knew better. She was offering him the option of strategic action, not retaliation, but containment, a calibrated move to prevent further erosion from within. Charles listened, carefully, and reluctantly he agreed, though not without placing limits. There would be no public denouncement, no formal reprimand, but Anne could proceed discreetly, with the palace's backing, so long as it remained off record. It wasn't weakness, it was calculation. A way to shield the crown while addressing the rot beneath it. Internally, aides gave it a name, Operation Veil. A strategy cloaked in silence but rooted in control. It would involve positioning, access, subtle exclusions, and above all, message management. Meghan wouldn't know it had begun, but she'd feel its consequences. The king had made his choice, not a full swing of the sword, but the drawing of one, a signal that the crown had noticed, and that internal loyalty would now be tested in private corridors rather than public theatres. But Anne, always the sharper blade behind the shield, had no plans to stop in the shadows. This wasn't just a matter of optics anymore. Not after what Catherine had endured, not after William's ultimatum, and certainly not after Meghan's calculated strike. But Anne had no intention of staying quiet because the next move had to be public. It was never supposed to happen in person, but it did. At a Windsor gathering, Anne approached Meghan directly, with no staff, no script, and no mercy. What followed was not a shouting match, but something far more brutal. The surgical calm of a royal who's had enough. And Meghan's reaction, startled, exposed, and very, very unprepared. The gathering was meant to be diplomatic, a quiet display of unity staged in the aftermath of rising tension. But beneath the polished surfaces and polite greetings, the air pulsed with unspoken resentment. Anne had watched from a distance long enough. The carefully crafted narratives, the interviews cloaked in victimhood, the passive jabs disguised as reflections. She had said nothing publicly, but that silence was ending now, With deliberate steps, she closed the distance between herself and Meghan, timing her approach so there would be no one to shield her, no staff member to interrupt, no cameras to reshape what was about to unfold. Meghan saw Anne coming, but what she encountered wasn't rage, it was resolve. Anne's tone was even, her posture unshaken, her message unmistakable. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," she said, voice low but piercing. There was no room for confusion, no space for retreat. Meghan's attempt to respond was immediate but uncertain. She invoked pressure, media distortion, misinterpretation. She spoke of tone, of timing, of being misunderstood. But Anne didn't flinch. She didn't need clarification. She had heard what was said about Catherine, and she had no patience for excuses dressed as apologies. The confrontation wasn't loud, but its impact echoed across the room. Anne didn't just defend Catherine, she named the stakes. She spoke of duty, of legacy, of children growing up in a monarchy that demanded strength and integrity from those who claimed to serve it. She pointed to the damage done not only to Catherine's reputation, but to the institution itself. The accusations weren't wild or unhinged, they were methodical. And with each word, Meghan's deflections began to crumble. Those who stood nearby didn't hear every word, but they saw enough. The tension was undeniable. Meghan's expression shifted from confident to cautious, her body language retreating, her voice dropping. And then, just like that, she left the room, visibly rattled, quietly humiliated. It wasn't an exit, it was an escape. And for the senior aides watching from the edge, the meaning was crystal clear. The royal silence had finally been broken from within, and the repercussions would be seismic. This wasn't just a moment of confrontation, it was a reckoning. A long-delayed response to words that should never have been spoken, and intentions that had gone unchecked for too long. Anne hadn't needed to raise her voice. She had raised the stakes, and in doing so, she had shifted the balance of power in ways Meghan hadn't anticipated. But Anne's confrontation wasn't the end, it was the fuse that lit the next royal explosion. William doesn't bluff, and this time he issued an ultimatum. If Charles didn't publicly support Catherine and denounce the behavior behind the scenes, William was ready to pull back from key duties. For the first time in decades, the future king gave the king a deadline, and Charles had to decide between peace and power. The storm was no longer contained. Anne's confrontation had sent tremors through the palace, and Catherine's quiet resolve had sent a message louder than any press release. But it was William who turned that pressure into a weapon. He didn't come to Charles as a son, he came as the heir. And he made it clear this wasn't about personalities anymore, it was about precedent, about the monarchy itself. Privately, William requested an audience. There were no aides in the room, no strategists, just father and son, bound by blood and power, separated by responsibility. William didn't waste time. He laid it out clearly. The silence surrounding the attack on Catherine could no longer be tolerated. Either the palace sent a message of solidarity with the future queen, or he would begin withdrawing from his duties, one engagement at a time. Charles tried to reason. He spoke of timing, of diplomacy, of the risks of appearing divided. But William didn't flinch. He'd seen the cost of delay before, watched narratives spiral out of control while the crown waited too long to respond. And this time, the insult hadn't come from the press or the public. It had come from within, from someone who once stood beside Catherine and now sought to undermine her from the shadows. William warned that Catherine had made her decision. She would not attend another public engagement until a line was drawn, not just for herself but for every future queen expected to endure in silence while others rewrote the truth. It wasn't defiance, it was dignity. Charles was torn. He saw the threat clearly, but so too did he see the headlines waiting to pounce. A father trying to balance loyalty to one son while defending the wife of another. The institution had always favored subtlety, but subtlety had allowed cracks to form. His advisors urged caution but agreed that a gesture, however modest, was now essential. They drafted statements, adjusted speeches, crafted lines that would suggest support without igniting war. But William didn't care for half measures. He wanted a message that couldn't be misread, reinterpreted, or dismissed. and just before leaving the room, William delivered the line that would haunt Charles long after the door closed. "If she goes down, so do I." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. A man prepared to sacrifice position for principle. And in that moment, Charles realized the choice was no longer his to delay. The crown had been tested and now it had to answer. But what the world didn't expect was how Catherine would respond with grace and fire. They thought she'd retreat. Instead, she returned with a presence more powerful than any statement. Catherine appeared at a high-profile event with Princess Anne by her side, no words spoken, no comment made. But the message was crystal clear: you cannot destroy what was built on dignity. And the world noticed, after weeks of speculation, silence and escalating tension, Catherine's absence had begun to shape the narrative as much as her presence once did. Rumors swirled, theories exploded, but she remained still, watching from behind palace gates while the institution wrestled with its own conscience. It wasn't retreat, it was calculation. And when the moment came, it was neither loud nor dramatic. It was surgical. Catherine chose her return not for spectacle but for symbolism. No press conference, no emotional interviews. Just one appearance, public, poised and unforgettable. The setting was deliberate, the timing even more so. And yet it was the person beside her that transformed the scene from a return to a declaration. Princess Anne walked in step with Catherine, hand linked, expression firm, gaze forward. Two women who had endured separately now moved as one. It was more than support. It was solidarity. And without saying a word, they said everything. Anne's presence wasn't just familial, it was strategic. It drew the eyes of those who understood royal language better than the spoken word. The message wasn't lost on the world, or the palace. Every detail, the location, the muted elegance, the grace under scrutiny, was weaponized with precision. This wasn't just Catherine reclaiming her space. It was Catherine commanding it. The press, once eager to speculate on rifts and rivalries, now turned its spotlight toward unity and strength. Headlines didn't hesitate: the crown's true sisterhood. Anne and Catherine, a silent RAI. GN, the Queen in waiting doesn't flinch. Public sentiment, long caught in the noise of back-and-forth allegations, began to crystallize. There was something unshakable about Catherine's stillness, something the chaos of others only amplified. And then there was Meghan. Her absence from the event was not explained, not acknowledged, and yet it was the loudest thing in the room. As Catherine stood tall, with Anne unflinching beside her, Meghan's silhouette lingered only as a shadow. What had started as whispered tension had now become a visual contrast between presence and disappearance. The public, even those once sympathetic to the Sussexes, began to draw their own conclusions. When dignity stands alone, it doesn't just speak, it eclipses. But for all the spectacle, this moment wasn't Catherine's revenge. It was her reaffirmation, a reminder of what she represented and why that terrified those who sought to unravel it. She hadn't fought back with scandal or defense. She'd answered with legacy. And for Anne, who had fought to defend Catherine behind closed doors, this was vindication in its purest form. But behind the headlines, one final move was still being made by someone no one expected. Just when tension seemed to settle, a letter surfaced written by someone close to Meghan, addressed to a palace official. Its contents? Devastating. It confirmed what Anne had said, exposed more than anyone knew, and forced the palace into damage control mode. And the leak? That's the P. RT that shook Buckingham to its core. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just as the monarchy was regaining control of the narrative after Catherine's return, Anne's silent defiance, and William's private ultimatum, an envelope arrived at Clarence's house, bearing an insignia no one expected to see. The handwriting was unmistakable. The source, chillingly close to the inner circle of the Sussexes. The letter was never meant for the public, but its contents read like a confession, a detailed recounting of private conversations between Meghan and her closest advisors. Names were named, lines were quoted, and the tone sharp, intentional, calculating, left no room for misinterpretation. Meghan hadn't just made an offhand remark about Catherine. She had weaponized perception, framing Catherine as fragile, unfit, and out of step with the modern monarchy. For the palace, it was nothing short of a grenade. Aides scrambled to assess how much had already been seen. Who else had copies? Would the press get wind of it? Could it be buried quietly, or would an attempt to suppress it only confirm the worst? The clock was ticking. Meetings were held in the early hours, phones went dark, and statements were drafted, but none of them good enough. Because this time, it wasn't a rumor, it was written proof. And worst of all, it came from within Meghan's own sphere, a betrayal that made the contents all the more believable. Anne was the first to demand full transparency. Her voice cut through the fog of royal diplomacy with a chilling clarity. No more silence. She had warned Charles weeks ago that waiting would be fatal. Now the evidence had arrived, uninvited, undeniable, and irreversible. The palace convened an emergency meeting between Charles, William, and their most senior aides. Emotions ran high. The king wrestled with the enormity of what lay before him, not just a public relations crisis, but a familial reckoning. William, colder now, offered no mercy. He didn't ask what would be done. He said what must be. Behind closed doors, discussions turned sharp. Distancing measures were raised, discreet but permanent. Events might be uninvited from. Patronages might quietly change hands. Access would be limited. And from that point on, anything said by or around the Sussexes would be viewed not as family matters but as external commentary. The door wouldn't be slammed shut, but it would no longer remain open. Still, one question haunted them all. Who leaked the letter? Was it sabotage from within? A calculated play by someone trying to force the palace's hand? Or a desperate act from someone who had finally seen enough? No answers came, only speculation. But the damage was already done. The letter couldn't be unsent. The words couldn't be unread. The crown had been burned from the inside. But even as the palace contained the fire, it couldn't erase the scars, and one final twist was still to come. In a rare moment of candor, Princess Anne issued a statement not through the press, but through her actions. Her final message was clear. The monarchy could no longer afford to protect those who undermine it from within. And as the dust settled, one truth remained. This wasn't just about a comment, it was about survival. The storm that had started with a whispered remark and spiraled into royal chaos finally came to rest in the most understated yet powerful of moments. Anne requested no audience, no press, and no ceremony. She simply visited Catherine. No aides, no cameras, just two women who had endured, weathered, and defended something greater than themselves. In that private conversation, Anne acknowledged what Catherine had borne and what she herself had chosen to expose. There was regret, yes, but not for what had been done, only that it had to be done at all. Anne's voice didn't shake, but her words carried the weight of a woman who knew that loyalty sometimes demands public consequence. "I wish it hadn't come to this," she told Catherine, "but silence was never going to save us." The impact of Anne's stand rippled further than headlines could reach. Within the palace, subtle shifts had already begun. Meghan and Harry were not formally exiled, but they were repositioned. Future planning quietly omitted their names. Invitations, roles, even logistics were re-evaluated with one guiding principle: stability. The distance wasn't loud, it was methodical. Appearances would remain courteous, but power had moved elsewhere. Behind closed doors, protocol was rewritten. Certain privileges were scaled back, access limited, and though no announcement confirmed it, everyone inside the institution understood things would not return to how they were. Then came Anne's public words, brief but sharp, spoken during a royal engagement and captured by a single microphone. When asked about her recent show of solidarity with Catherine, she replied simply, "Guarding the institution sometimes means guarding those who represent its future." It wasn't a rebuke, it was a reckoning. For a royal who had built her legacy on discipline, discretion, and unwavering service, it was the closest thing to a battle cry the public had ever heard. The reaction was swift and divided. Some called it courageous, others calculated. But what mattered was the effect. For the first time, the palace had responded not with silence, but with clarity. Meghan and Harry's standing shifted not through scandal, but through silence, the kind that follows when trust is broken beyond repair. And though their title, ES, remained intact, the reality beneath them had changed forever. In the end, it wasn't about winning. It wasn't about who had spoken louder or who had drawn more sympathy. It was about who had endured with integrity when the storm came. And as Catherine stood at the heart of the monarchy, still unshaken, it became clear who the institution had chosen to protect. Anne's final words to Charles, as later recalled by a senior aide, echoed like prophecy. There will be no next time. It wasn't a threat. It was a vow. A final warning that the line had been drawn, and this time the monarchy would not look away. And with that, a new chapter begins, one forged not by titles, but by loyalty, truth, and the silence that finally broke. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.